I want to welcome all of you, and particularly friends of ours who are joining us for the first time. Thank you very much. And in particular, I want all of us, Brian and Steve, would you just come up for a few minutes, or stand up where you are. This is Steve Lohman and Brian Doyle. They are the wealth advisors who made a major contribution and it is because of their contribution in particular that you each have a booklet and that we have the refreshments that we do. Thank you. So thank you. We also welcome guests who have come from southern New Hampshire and from up north. Welcome to all of you. A lot of people walked in and looked at me with great disappointment. Where's Mosen? I spoke with Mosen. Mosen will be here, God willing, Allah willing, next Saturday morning. He says he does have a presentation with some group at the United Nations on Friday afternoon, but by 5 or 6 o'clock next Friday, he should be able to get in his car and drive up here. And so he promised me that he'll be here next Saturday morning. And he asked me how much time. I said, Mosen, the morning is yours. Wonderful. So he looks forward to meeting you, and you will be dumbstruck listening to Mosen coming up from Columbia University. Okay, you each have your books, and you know pretty much what we're doing. And I thought a little bit of how I wanted to introduce this last lecture of mine in this series. And basically, I really want all of us to appreciate the story of the question, whose land is it anyway? Because it's a story that leads up to the importance of the question, whose land is it anyway? So in review, but part of the story that I've been trying to weave for you and outlined in your booklet is the first that we talked about, the Promised Land. After that, we talked about all those people who have lived in this land, the land that was promised apparently, supposedly, by God to Abraham and his descendants, and then after that presumed promise, all those people who actually did live on the land. We went through that. And then of extreme importance is why, for so long, did people hate the Jews? And we went through an hour and a half's worth of reasons why the Jews were hated. And then that led into, because of this worldwide hatred, the longest hatred that have existed in human history of one group, why they needed to flee, and the history of their running, because they were so hated. And finally, after running, where to? Where would they go? And we went through the Dreyfus trial in Paris, and the fact that Theodor Herzl attended that trial in Paris and then wrote the book, The Jewish State, and pulled together leaders from across mostly Europe in Basel, Switzerland, for the first Zionist Congress, which led to the effort by Zionists to finally leave a place, Europe, which was literally horrible to them, and the only place that they could figure out to flee, which seemed reasonable to them at that time, was the Holy Land, Palestine. So now my job today, appreciating that background and that history, is to answer the question, why no peace? Why can't these people just get along anyway? That's the question. Why? So let's go look at the results of the dispute. What we're going to see today are the results of the dispute of whose land is it anyway. So to appreciate this nagging question, whose land is it anyway, we really have to appreciate that there are basically, for the Zionists, for the Israelis, for the Jews, there are two enemies for them, but they both have the same goal. From within the country, there are the displaced Palestinians who are livid, furious that they were forced to leave their homes, whether by finance or by guns. And from without the country, the surrounding Arab states, every one of them, would like the state of Israel to disappear. So the Zionists, the Jews, the Israelis presently are fighting two different groups of people, one from within their state and one from without. And that is critical to understand, to appreciate the history that has ensued. So I think it's probably fair to say, and Mosen will give us his view as a Palestinian next week, I would guess 90% of the Palestinians and 90% of the Israelis would like to live in peace, to send their kids to school, to have a good meal, to live the kind of lives we live. 90% would be very happy to do that. But the extremist goals on both sides have caused world havoc. First, the Arabs and the surrounding Arabs and the Palestinians, the extremists, would like to eliminate the state of Israel and drive the Jews into the sea. No question about it. How many? A very small minority. But they would like to do that. And on the other hand, the extremist Israelis, who believed that Judea and Samaria was Jewish land back to Abraham, and they had states there with Saul, David, and Solomon for 2,000 years. It's their land. And these people who've been living there have been simply intruders. And the right-wing Zionists in Israel, about which you read, and they're doing a pretty good job of wiping out 40,000 plus Palestinians who are crammed into Gaza. And this is part of what they would like, to have the Palestinians disappear and have the land to themselves. So basically you have two groups, each of whom wants the other out, both from within and from without. So to appreciate the conundrum, on both sides, what for Israel is not negotiable? Survival. That's it. It doesn't make any difference to whom you talk, whether it's Netanyahu or Ehud Olmert. It makes no difference. The bottom line is survival. And that's the same for every state. The United States has this huge military force for our survival. That's the bottom line for every state. They want to survive. The Palestinian hopes is to return to their homes and their land, to the pre-1967 borders, and I picked 67 because that was the time of the Six-Day War, and we'll talk about that. They would not only like to return to their land on which they lived and their homes, but they would like to have a state, i.e. this two-state solution. The problem with the two-state solution is that everyone who considers a state considers it isn't a state unless it's sovereign. By sovereign, we mean they can make all their own decisions. And I can tell you right off the bat, to make it very simple, that because the Israelis put survival at the very top, they're not going to allow the Palestinians to have a sovereign state, i.e. that means the Palestinians can then bring in arms, ammunition, rockets into the West Bank, because that would immediately threaten Israel. And so you see these two forces are absolutely colliding, and essentially two people want the same place. And so it's a sort of a dream, this two-state solution. What kind of state? And that is the problem. Any questions about what I've just said? Is that you got the conundrum of why there's this problem? Welcome, Sven. Okay, so let's go back to May 1948. Israel declares independence, May 1948, and then what happened? The United States, the United Nations agreed on a partition of the Holy Land. And you can see the map here of the partition, in which the Jews actually received more than they had expected. The United Nations gave them 55% of the land, and they gave to the Palestinians 43% of the land, as outlined here, with 2% representing Jerusalem, which would be controlled by both groups and would be an international city. So the Palestinians, by the United Nations, were given 43% of the lands, the Jews 55% of the land in 1948. What happened immediately? The Palestinians rejected statehood on 43% of the land. And the United Nations very clearly said, you can have the state of Palestine on that amount of land. And they rejected it. Rejected it such that on the following day, following the having to move, upwards of 700 to 750,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes by the Zionists. And here are a few photos for us to appreciate the horror of the situation. The Palestinians prepared to attack and fight the Zionists, who had now just become Israelis. The Palestinians attacked, and that is known as the War of Independence. The day after the state of Israel was born, and essentially the state of Palestine. And they could have accepted that and said, here we have our own state. But they wanted all of the land, and so they decided to fight for it. The fighting took place from May 48, immediately the day after the state of Israel was born, until March 1949. And in the slides that I'm going to show you, I'm going to put a Star of David on each of the wars. So this represents the first war that the Israelis fought with the Palestinians, the War of Independence. For the Palestinians, this was what they refer to as Nakba, al-Nakba, the catastrophe. The War of Independence was admittedly and in very real forms a total catastrophe for the Palestinians, and you will see why. The war lasted about 10 months. The Palestinians were defeated completely, and the Israelis ended up, because they'd been attacked and to defend themselves, with a gain of 23% of the land. So they now had 78% rather than 55%, and the Palestinians were reduced to the two little areas you see, the West Bank, with Jerusalem in the middle, and the Gaza Strip, about which you read in the papers. In the 50s and 60s, there were a number of what they call Fedayeen insurgencies, which were attacks by frustrated Arab states from without, and the attacks came from Syria, Egypt, Jordan, and the reprisals from the Zionists and Israel were swift and brutal as a matter of survival. There was a high blood cost in order to defer future attacks. And during this time, the four underground Israeli fighting forces came together, known as, I mentioned before, the Irgun, the Stern Gang, the Palmach, of which some of their members, we now know their names today. At that time, David Ben-Gurion said, "We will continue the peace process as if there is no terror, and we will fight terror as if there is no peace process. He was talking about the surrounding states, and this is what they were faced with. Every state around the tiny sliver of Israel was out to wipe them out. And so the Israelis were fighting for their survival. And here in summary are essentially the 8 major wars that have occurred in just 75 years. And I'm going to go through each of these, but you see them in summary, that it has been an unrelenting fight for survival between the Israelis and the Palestinians on the inside and the Israelis and the surrounding countries on the outside. October 1956, perhaps you remember Nasser and the Suez Crisis. After the United States and Britain decided not to fund the building of the Aswan Dam, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt decided to nationalize the Suez Canal and close the Strait of Tiran. You notice how important the Suez Canal is, mostly to British shipping interests, but also to tiny Israel and the Port of Eilat and their entrance to the Indian Ocean that the Egyptians threatened. And here is another picture to get your geography where the Suez Canal is, and the blue arrow points to the Port of Eilat, the very, very southern tip of Israel, which is on the Gulf of Aqaba, and the Strait of Tiran is at the southern end of that. This is what the Suez Canal looks like, with military force going through it. And here's a picture from the air of what this actually really does look like. I put some red lines in to show you where Israel is, the Suez Canal, and the Strait of Tiran at the southern tip near Sharm el-Sheikh, which was closed by the Egyptians to prevent the Israelis from coming out on their southern tip. At this time in '59, Yasser Arafat founds the organization Fatah in Palestine, and what was its goal? The uprooting of the Zionist entity from our land, and the goal of Fatah was to liberate the land from all Jews. And here are some photographs from that time that their intention was to get rid of the Israelis. I throw in the fact that in 1961, the Eichmann trial, perhaps you remember, took place, and the importance of this for the state of Israel was the need of the Jewish people for a land of their own because of what they had tolerated and underwent and died in Europe. And then June 5th to 10th, 1967, the Six-Day War. To my mind, no other event has so profoundly affected Israel and resulted in the present disaster in Gaza as what happened in early June 1967. What happened about which so many of us were so jubilant 57 years ago? To fully understand this and the Six-Day War, there are 2 super books which I recommend and have listed in your booklet: 6 Days of War by Michael Oren and The Accidental Empire. This will give you the facts. But what simply put happened is that in early June 1967, with Mossad intelligence, Mossad is the CIA of Israel, their intelligence learned that Egyptian troops had crossed the Suez Canal, ready to enter the Sinai Peninsula, poised to attack from the west. From the north and east, they determined that Jordania and Syria were massing their troops, all planning for a surprise, coordinated attack from the north, from the east, and from the west to wipe out the state of Israel. Israel understood the existentialist threat and appreciated that offense is often the best defense, but was not able to afford the luxury of appreciating that a successful offense can lead to unwanted chaos. Moshe Dayan, Israeli defense minister, acted preemptively in the early dark hours of June 5th, while all of us were asleep. In 6 days, the Israeli Defense Forces literally destroyed the entire military forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The first evening, they started at night. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed before the sun came up. Leading without authorization, events just occurred too rapidly and unexpectedly for careful planning, and improvising to fit the moment's opportunities, taking advantage of the Arabs' military disorganization and planning, improvising to fit the moment's opportunities, taking advantage of the Arabs' military disorganization and ineptitude, the Israelis on the morning of June 11th found that they had conquered and gained 26,000 square miles, 3 times the size of Israel 6 days before. With a pre-war population of 2.7 million citizens, most of them Jewish, Israel now occupied land that was home to an additional estimated 1.1 million Arab non-citizens. After the fighting ended, with survival ensured and the goal of the 3 Arab states to wipe out Israel denied, 3 problems arose. What was the purpose of the land gained? What to do with the Arab Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank? We have the land, we control it, but now what do we do with these people? And what about Israelis referred to as settlers who would move into the newly conquered but disputed Palestinian West Bank? They're claiming it to be not the West Bank, but their land, Judea and Samaria. Jewish land then, Jewish land now. The 1.1 Arab Palestinians, no longer controlled by Jordan, were more of a problem for the Israelis. What rights do they have? What rights should they have? What rights should we grant them? Of what country are they citizens? Could they own land? To whom should they expect to look for administration, responsibility, and control? Jordan refused to accept them, and those that had moved to Jordan were put in refugee camps and not in any way welcomed into Amman or any of their cities in Jordan. With the sudden unexpected victory by the Jews, actions of great consequence had been taken by a few Israelis creating facts on the ground, using fait accompli to determine the political future of a disputed land. A small cadre of Israeli leaders agreed the citizenship could not be granted to over 1 million Arabs, but neither could Israel effectively rule over them. What to do? A real problem. The 6-day war ended in a victory of total confusion. And what about Israelis who felt they had a God-given right to live on the land that they had just conquered? Their presence was officially referred to as belligerent occupation. The Fourth Geneva Convention, adopted in 1949, clearly stated that no occupying power shall deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory of its occupiers. So Israel had conquered the West Bank. And according to the Geneva Convention, which was put on by the International Red Cross in Geneva in 1949, if you look this up, it's fully described. In 1949, in Article 49, it made it very clear, the rules of war, is that no conquering power legally can move its citizens into the conquered land. Thus, the moving of Jewish settlers into the area, whatever its name, Samaria, Judea, the West Bank, formerly Jordan, is illegal under international law. But here you see the purple dots, which show now Israeli settlements in the West Bank. These fanatic right-wing Jews claiming that this is our land, and they are now living in the conquered land against the 1949 Geneva Convention, which was drawn up in 1949. How bad is it? Today, there are approximately 2.8 million Palestinians trying to survive in the West Bank, with no responsible government to rely upon, and among them, approximately 750,000 Orthodox Jews who feel to their bones that God promised them this land. One group has guns to fire. The other group have rocks to throw. And we will hear about this next week from Mosen, who lived in the West Bank, in Ramallah. That's where he grew up as a fourth-generation Palestinian in this West Bank. What followed were wars of attrition between 1967 and 70. Egypt wanted to recapture the Sinai. Israel fought continuing battles with Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and the Palestine Liberation Organization. A ceasefire in 1970 with frontiers unchanged. The wars went on for 3 years and nothing changed. Now I'm going to share with you as I go over the next few minutes what I refer to as terrorism built out of frustration. You can imagine the frustration built up among the groups there. We read about it, we feel it, but we don't live it. They're living it. And so I'm going to show you some international episodes which occurred, which must now, in retrospect, be looked upon, I would suggest, as terrorism built out of frustration. On July 23rd, 1968, there was a hijacking of an El Al plane, 426, by 3 members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which set off a wave of further hijackings by frustrated Palestinians. The aircraft, a Boeing 707 in this case, was en route from London to Israel via Rome. The plane was diverted to Algiers. The action, this hijacking, would change the way the world and all of us would fly from that date on. Before this incident, we walked into Logan Airport, we bought a ticket, we went to the boarding gate, and we walked on. There was no security. Because of this hijacking in 1968, the entire world changed in terms of how we board an airplane. When the plane landed, Algerian authorities impounded the plane. The Israeli and Algerian governments eventually negotiated the return of the hostages and the plane in a swap for 16 convicted Arab terrorists. King Hussein of Jordan, frustrated with Arafat, expelled him. Arafat fled to Lebanon. He would return to Amman and be expelled again in 1988, I'm sorry. Gamal Abdel Nasser, we remember him. Nasser, we read about him, I think, when we were in high school, right? The name we all know. Nasser, what was Nasser's vision? His vision was a pan-Arabism where all the northern African Arab countries would unite and form a group known as the Pan-Arab States. And this was a meeting that he called in September of 1970, and they should all get together and somehow plan to finally get rid of the State of Israel. That same year, Nasser died, and so did Pan-Arabism. And that's the last the world heard of these groups getting together to get rid of Israel. In 1970, there was the birth, in the wake of Nasser's death, of Palestinian nationalism, which took the form of this sort of frustration and anger and the face that we all know. Frustration ruled. In 1972, we've all heard of the Munich massacre, in which Black September terrorists went over to Germany for the Summer Olympics, killing 11 Israeli athletes. For no reason, nothing was achieved, but it was terrorism built out of frustration. But nothing was working at the negotiating table. They had no state of their own, and this was the result of frustration leading to terrorism. And here are some pictures of Munich at that time. This was where the Israeli athletes were housed. These were pictures of the Palestinians. These were the 11 athletes that were murdered. On the night of April 9th, in the early morning of April 10th, Israeli army units attacked PLO targets in Beirut, Lebanon. Israel believed in retaliation and the concept of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This operation in retaliation was dubbed Operation Spring of Youth or Operation Wrath of God, in retaliation for the Munich massacre at the Summer Olympics of 1972. And here is the Israelis going over to Lebanon, just south of Beirut. The PLO relocated themselves from Jordan to the southern part of Lebanon, from where attacks on Israelis in the Galilee continued for the following 9 years, culminating in the all-out 1982 Lebanon War, which would be the fifth war. But before that, between October 6th and 25th, 1973, the Yom Kippur War took place, the fourth war. It was the first of what were to be the two major Israeli intelligence catastrophes. The other one back on October 7th of last year. This was a catastrophe of the failure of intelligence, no less than what happened a year ago. It was the first intelligence catastrophe for Israel, but as we know, not the last. A surprise attack. Egypt and Syria attempted to recapture territories lost in the Six-Day War. Here they are crossing. The fourth war. And here you see a map. The Israelis, the Sinai Peninsula was supposed to be devoid of all military forces and a huge buffer zone between Egypt and Israel. This is a close-up showing the Egyptian forces having crossed the Suez Canal into the Sinai Peninsula, which provoked the Israelis to immediately attack. They did not do well because it was a surprise. Their intelligence had totally failed. Here you see some pictures. And so if you remember, it was Henry Kissinger who finally had to step in and flew over to the Middle East. Here are some further pictures because the Israelis actually were so successful in pushing the Egyptians back that it was possible, it was very clearly possible that the Israelis could continue into downtown Cairo. And Kissinger absolutely, under Nixon, did not want that to happen. And Kissinger, here you see, speaking with Nixon and with Anwar Sadat, was very forceful in convincing the Israelis to pull back. You've gotten the Egyptians out of the Sinai Peninsula. You don't have to go any further and cause even worse problems by going into Cairo. And then just shortly thereafter, a new problem, July 1976. What was so important about July 1976? Well, if you remember, July 1976 was the 200th anniversary of our freedom, the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1976. And I don't know how many of you were in New York at that time. I wasn't. But up the Hudson River came all these big masted boats. Anybody in New York at that time?
In 76, no.
No. Right. But the boats were there, George. And it was a big celebration. The reason I mention this, we were celebrating, but they weren't celebrating in Israel, because what had happened, another example of terrorism out of frustration, an Air France plane had been hijacked and forced to land in Uganda. They held all the people on the airplane, mostly Israeli citizens, hostages at the Entebbe airport in Uganda. And this was going on exactly while we were celebrating the 4th of July and our boats coming up the Hudson River. And let me show you what the map looked like and how far away from Tel Aviv this was. This was 2,760 miles away, and we were celebrating the 4th of July with firecrackers, and this was what was happening in the Middle East. Here's Idi Amin of Uganda, you may remember some of this, greeting the passengers who were now hostages at the airport in Uganda. Here is the group that was put together in Tel Aviv after much thought. The Israelis felt they had to rescue these hostages, 2,700 miles away. Their leg up was that the Israelis had built the airport at Entebbe. They knew every corner, they knew every electrical outlet, they knew everything. So they quickly built a model of it in Israel and trained the forces to get on the plane, fly these 2,700 miles down to Uganda, to Entebbe. Here are the aviators who were aboard the plane, and here are the released hostages after a gun battle in the waiting room at the Uganda Entebbe airport. And you see them returning back to Israel. And what turns out to be the case is that there was one elderly woman whose name I forget, but she was put in the hospital. They did not bring her back. She was in a hospital in Uganda. And one Israeli died, and it turned out that it was a young man by the name of Yoni Netanyahu. Yoni happens to be the brother of Benjamin Netanyahu. And I happen to think that this is incredibly important because this is what's still in the heart of the Prime Minister of Israel, is his brother was slaughtered by these terrorists at the Entebbe airport in 1976. And then the world is shocked 1 year later. 1 year later, the world saw the first peace move, the first attempt to bring the sides together in 29 years, in November 1977. The world is stunned. Sadat decides to visit Begin in Jerusalem. That nobody would have conceived that an Egyptian president would fly across the Sinai to have a meeting in Jerusalem. If you remember, 10 years previously, Israel had gained the Sinai Peninsula during the Six-Day War in an overnight battle against the Egyptians, in which by morning the Egyptian Air Force had been wiped out, and Israel came into possession of the entire Sinai Peninsula. Over the years, those 10 years, Sadat in Cairo watched Begin encourage Jewish settlers to move into the Sinai and build homes and build little villages in the Sinai Peninsula as if it were their land forever. Begin and Sadat got together. The world was stunned. Now the attempt to make peace with this rapprochement between the Egyptians and the Israelis. Jimmy Carter saw an opportunity in September of 1978. Carter, appreciating Sadat visiting Begin in Jerusalem, turned his attention to Egypt, an Israeli problem he thought he could solve. Camp David Accord with Carter, Begin, and Sadat. The Sinai Peninsula is returned to Egypt after 11 years, barring military from either Egypt or Israel. And here are some photos of the gentleman from Plains, Georgia, who saw an opportunity to capitalize on Sadat being brave enough to fly over to Jerusalem and shake hands with Menachem Begin. And here he is with seeing the opportunity, and he called these people together. Begin and Sadat sitting down together at Camp David just outside Washington. And here are some photos taken at that time. Brzezinski, Carter, T-shirts. This is really quite unbelievable. The world couldn't believe that someone such as Carter could bring these two men together, but it was actually initiated by Anwar Sadat. If they can't solve the problem, maybe they can play a game of chess. I mean, this is pretty heady days. And here they are.
Four different wars in 25 years in the Middle East. Every time the American worldwide nuclear forces had been placed on alert was a result of the combat in the Middle East. The Middle East is an area of tremendous concentration of long-standing historic hatred, distrust based on race, religion, and a fight over precious land. And these complicated issues had to be addressed in order to make sure we had peace not only in that region, but also that our country in the future wouldn't be faced with the prospect of a war in which we were directly involved.
So I'm going to make a list as we go along of the attempts to bring about peace. And this was certainly the first one. 1977, Begin, Sadat, and Carter at Camp David. But 4 years later, the Israelis discovered that the Iraqis had a nuclear facility and they were close to making an atomic bomb. On June 7th, 1981, with no announcement to anyone, our State Department or otherwise, the Israeli Air Force took off and in the middle of the night wiped out the nuclear facilities in Iraq. This was called Operation Babylon, which occurred in 1981, 4 years after the Camp David Accord with Carter, Begin, and Sadat. And what grew out of this and operational today is what became known as the Begin Doctrine. The right of Israel to preemptive strike against any nuclear weapon intended to and capable of destroying Israel. And this is what plays front and center with decisions today with Iran. And this is the fear that everyone has, that Israel did it then, and they can do it now, and they can do it in the middle of the night without any announcement to anyone. As was explained to me, the hesitation that Israel has now as against Iraq is that Iran has multiple sites with possible retaliation weapons. In Iraq, it was easy. You get one and that's it. But the problem is for Israel is that they may not get all of them. And if they don't get all of them, Israel has only 3 major cities and could easily be wiped out the next morning if there were retaliation. So with all the good attempts by Anwar Sadat to bring the groups together, what happened? Anwar Sadat was assassinated. Assassinated by an Egyptian because he went to Israel and tried to make peace. So this would play itself out again, as you will see shortly. But for all the good intentions that Anwar Sadat showed in not only going to Jerusalem to meet with Begin, but to fly to Camp David and bring about an accord with the Israelis, pulling all of their villages out of the Sinai Peninsula and giving the land to Egypt as a no man's land. No weapons were to be allowed in the Sinai Peninsula. Anwar Sadat achieved that, and because of his rapprochement with Israel, he was assassinated. He was assassinated because he had signed a peace agreement. In 1948, 110,000 Palestinians had fled Israel to Lebanon, fellow Arabs, but not welcomed by the Lebanese, ending up in refugee camps. By 1975, the number of Palestinians forced to live in Lebanese refugee camps had grown to 300,000, due to Palestinians fleeing Jordan, where they were no more welcome than they had been in Israel. And here are some photos of what it looks like in Palestinian refugee camps in southern Lebanon. A series of attacks and counterattacks between the frustrated Palestinians operating in southern Lebanon under directions from the PLO and the Israeli Defense Forces continued for years. And all of this, I suggest, should be understood as terrorist attacks emanating out of frustration. And then Palestinian gunmen attempted to assassinate Shlomo Argov, Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom. An Israeli bus traveling the coastal road south from Haifa to Tel Aviv was hijacked with the murder of 38 and the injuring of 71 other passengers. The machine gunning of an Israeli plane by Palestinian militants at Athens airport would cause Israel to retaliate by bombing the Beirut airport, destroying 13 civilian aircraft. It should be remembered that Israel lives by the Hammurabi Code, 1750 BCE, the Babylonian king who believed in appropriate punishment for the appropriate crime, i.e. an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And this is Israel's bottom line, that they will retaliate and retaliate in force, and that comes from the Babylonian Hammurabi. On June 6, 1982, Israel had had enough and invaded southern Lebanon. The 1982 Lebanon War, which was the 5th major war. The Israeli military occupied southern Lebanon in pursuit of the Palestinian insurgents, and then over the years found itself having to deal with not only Arafat's PLO, but Christian Maronites who were fighting the Lebanese Muslims, and the Lebanese Sunnis fighting the Iran-backed Shias. Beirut, the Paris of the Middle East. How many of you ever visited Beirut? Anybody? What years? What years were you there?
In the early 1970s.
Was it beautiful?
Oh, yes. It was quite nice.
Any comments?
64.
I'm sorry?
64.
64? Was it a beautiful city?
Beautiful.
Beautiful city. Yeah, it was. Beautiful.
Yeah, I've never been there, but it's been described as the Paris of the Middle East. Yeah, well, it isn't that way anymore. Beirut, the Paris of the Middle East, due to the Sykes-Picot arrangement of 1916, was being destroyed in the mid-1980s. On August 12, 1982, the PLO, 9,000 fighters and another 6,000 Syrian troops were forced out of Lebanon. Arafat, who had been forced out of Jordan in 1973 and now out of Lebanon, set sail for Tunisia. By expelling the PLO, removing Syrian influence over Lebanon, and installing a pro-Israeli Christian government in what was a city referred to as the Paris of the Middle East, led by a reasonable and educated president, Bashir Gamial, Israel hoped to sign a treaty and end this dispute with Lebanon, which Begin promised would give Israel 40 years of peace. That was the hope with a Western-educated Bashir Gamial. But just like Sadat, Gamial was assassinated in September 1982 for wanting peace with Israel. The fighting in Lebanon, which began in 1982, lasted for 15 years, made worse by Shia-backed Palestinian guerrillas in a Sunni country, calling themselves Hezbollah, and led by Hassan Nasrallah, about whom we read just a few weeks ago, was assassinated. Mr. Nasrallah's announced reason for living: to destroy the state of Israel, driving its citizens into the sea. War number 6, 1987 to 93, was referred to as the First Intifada, born out of widespread frustrations. Large-scale, informal Palestinian uprising with rocks and Molotov cocktails against Israel in the West Bank and Gaza. And next week, you'll be able to ask Mosen what it was like to be a Palestinian teenager in Ramallah, where his friends spent their time throwing rocks at Israeli tanks and Israeli forces. Mosen, having made the decision, he'll explain this to you, that it would be better to go to the university and read books and study. And that's what he did, rather than throw rocks. Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood movement, which had been active in the Gaza Strip since the 50s, gained influence through a network of mosques, charitable and social organizations, forming itself in 1988 into the organization Hamas. And today, Hamas is the reason for President el-Sisi of Egypt, a reason for his fear of the Gazans coming into Egypt and overthrowing him. Because you ask, well, why don't the Egyptians just open up their gates and let these Gazans who are trapped into Egypt? You got the whole Sinai Peninsula. And the reason is because el-Sisi, the president, is afraid of this Muslim Brotherhood overthrowing his position as president of Egypt. The organization Hamas, with roots in Egypt, was predicated on their insistence that the Jews founded the United Nations and its Security Council in order to rule the world, as if they had taken to heart every word of the protocols of the elders of Zion. Hamas places responsibility for all international wars, including the revolutions in France and Russia and World War I and II, at the foot of the Jews. Its policy was enunciated clearly for the world to hear: Jews must be driven from the river to the sea. Jordan, meanwhile, renounced its claim and responsibility to the West Bank, leaving the Palestinians there with no hope from Amman. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Hamas conducted numerous suicide bombings and other attacks against Israel, disputing whose land is it anyway. Nasser was dead. Pan-Arabism's potential threat to Israel was a thing of the past. Israel's military superiority had effectively neutralized any Syrian threat. Jordan was willing to live in peace. Yet once again, Israel found itself arrayed against another enemy sworn to its destruction, an enemy within, the Palestinians, frustrated to the core. And then 1991, Madrid. Seen as a window of opportunity by Bush after his success in expelling Iraqi forces from Kuwait during the Gulf War, our president wanted to use his considerable diplomatic experience and the idea of swapping land for peace to bring peace to Israel and the Palestinians by inviting the Soviet Union, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan to meet in Spain. It is unknown, actually, whether Bush appreciated the fact that Spain was where the Jews were given three choices 500 years prior: convert to Catholicism, leave, or be killed. Despite U.S. Secretary of State James Baker making eight follow-up diplomatic visits to the region, nothing of lasting value was achieved. And here we now have another failed attempt to bring peace to the Middle East. 1992, Oslo. Frustrated by the failures of the politicians at the Madrid conference, academics from around the world, Sweden, Norway, Israel, Egypt, and Harvard, academics from many countries decided to meet in private, in secret negotiations at a meeting place in Oslo, Norway. It turns out, just parenthetically, that does anybody in the room know Everett Mendelsohn? Tom? Did you know Everett? Okay. Everett Mendelsohn was a professor of the history of science at Harvard, often gave the most popular course at the college, and he and I became friends after I left medicine and moved up to earn a degree between Harvard and Dartmouth. And I sat in Everett's office many times, and he was explaining to me that he was one of those who were accepted by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which has its offices in Cambridge, to fly over to Oslo and meet with pure academics from Israel, Egypt, Norway, United States, and try to work out some peace process called the Oslo Accords. His name was never mentioned, and in fact, if you try to look it up, it's impossible to find who attended these meetings in Oslo. U.S. government officials were briefed on the work that they did, but no government official participated in that work. The idea was hatched in Norway by these academics, including my friend Everett Mendelsohn, to bring Rabin and Arafat together. Let's bring these two together like Carter had brought together Menachem Begin and Sadat so they could talk to each other. As a result of the behind-the-scenes work by the academics in Norway, the first face-to-face meeting between the government of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, and the PLO chairman Arafat took place under the watchful eyes of United States President Bill Clinton in Washington.
For today, at least, it was a moment to savor. The Prime Minister of Israel and the chairman of the PLO, who have spent most of their lives trying to destroy each other, here on a common platform at the White House, speaking of peace and shaking hands, not once but twice. They know that there are difficult days and issues ahead, but if the spirit that prevailed here today can be extended, finally, there is hope for peace in a place where there has been war almost without end. NBC's Andrea Mitchell begins our coverage of the memorable and joyful ceremonies here today.
It was nothing short of breathtaking. Two veteran warriors of Middle East battlefields joining a young American president in the first step toward peace. It was a day of unbelievable moments. Yasser Arafat, an honored guest at the White House, clearly relishing his new legitimacy. Arab diplomats greeting Israeli leaders for the first time. And at Arafat's instigation, a handshake between two men who have been bitter enemies for decades. Presiding over this stunning moment, Clinton paid tribute to his predecessors.
And we salute the wise leadership of President Jimmy Carter. And today we also express our deep thanks for the skillful leadership of President George Bush.
Only minutes before the agreement was to be signed, a final dispute had to be resolved. The word PLO was inserted where the document had earlier referred to Arafat's group as the Palestinian team.
This signing of the Israeli-Palestinian Declaration of Principle here today, it's not so easy. We who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
Let me address the people of Israel and their leaders with whom we are meeting today for the first time. And let me assure them that the difficult decision we reached together was one that required great and exceptional courage. The children of Abraham, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, have embarked together on a bold journey. Together, today, with all our hearts and all our souls, we bid them shalom, salam, peace.
Breaking in the...
So the list continues. Number 3, 1993, the Oslo Accords, in an attempt to bring peace and decide whose land is it anyway, with people living together. The documents were additionally signed later by Mahmoud Abbas for the PLO, former Foreign Minister Shimon Peres for Israel, and Secretary of State Warren Christopher for the United States. Of monumental significance was that for the first time, the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist in return for the promise by Israel that they would withdraw their military forces from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In Israel, secular Jews supported the accord. Orthodox Jews opposed any accommodation with the Palestinians. Palestinian reactions were also divided. Fatah, the group that represented the Palestinians in the negotiations, accepted the accords. But Hamas in Gaza, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in the West Bank, and Hezbollah in Lebanon all objected and were opposed to the accords which were arrived at. The right of return and sovereignty for a state of Palestine were not discussed. The key issues, the big issues, were not discussed. They discussed the details, but not the underlying big issues. But so momentous was this coming together that in Stockholm, the Nobel Committee awarded the 1994 Peace Prize to Rabin, Peres, and Arafat for their getting together and at least talking as a result of the Oslo efforts. The result? The Palestinians achieved self-governance of major cities in the West Bank and administration of the entire Gaza Strip. Israel maintained and continues to maintain a presence in the West Bank for security reasons. The Oslo Accords of 1993 between Rabin and Arafat had provided that agreement should be reached on all outstanding issues within 5 years. But of course, if you look at what was agreed upon and what was left yet to discuss, the major issues were left to discuss, and they could agree on the simple problems. The interim process put in place under Oslo had fulfilled neither Israeli nor Palestinian expectations. The accords, carefully crafted by academics in Norway, were all about details, ignoring the real issue. Fanatics on both sides wanted all of the land for themselves. Oslo I never resulted in peace. By the time Clinton left office, the peace process had run aground, and a new round of Israeli-Palestinian violence had begun. On that happy note, thanks to Brian and Steve, we have refreshment break. So let's take a break and come back in about 15 minutes. My last words before the break were, by the time Clinton left office, the peace process had run aground, and a new round of Israeli-Palestinian violence had begun. February 1994, Baruch Goldstein, an Israeli-American, right-wing religious zealot, became upset that the Oslo meetings might lead to a reconciliation with the Palestinians. On February 25, 1994, Goldstein, a resident of the illegal Israeli settlement of Kiryat Arba in the West Bank, entered a room in the Cave of the Patriarchs that was serving as a mosque. Dressed in Israeli military uniform, he opened fire on the 800 Palestinian Muslims worshippers praying there during the month of Ramadan, killing 29 and wounding 125. Once again, a religious zealot had torpedoed peace negotiations. May 1994, the Cairo Agreement. Arafat and Rabin did get together, as envisioned by the academics in Norway. They met in Cairo and finalized Israel withdrawal from most of Gaza and Jericho, the West Bank. October 1994, a few months later, Clinton lent his support by hosting King Hussein and Rabin in Washington for the signing of the Cairo Agreement. Israel and Jordan would henceforth recognize each other in their right to exist. Now the list is extended. Number 4, the major attempt to bring about peace. September 1995. The follow-up agreement to Oslo I was first signed in the Sinai Peninsula and later by Rabin and Arafat and witnessed by Bill Clinton. The importance of the Oslo II package was that both the Israelis and the Palestinians recognized the other's right to exist. So we're down to the 5th, now the Oslo II Accord. But the accords actually achieved nothing. The Palestinians were sorely frustrated and furious that they had been waiting too long and given too little, while the conservative Orthodox Jews were fearful that Rabin was giving away too much. November 1995, speaking in Tel Aviv, celebrating the peace agreement, with a large crowd in Tel Aviv looking on, right-wing Orthodox Jewish zealot Yigal Amir, furious with Rabin's wanting to make peace, appeared out of nowhere and shot and killed Rabin. Rabin's murder was followed by a string of terrorist attacks by Hamas, which undermined support for the more liberal Labor Party in Israel's May 1996 elections. Elected for a short 7-month term as the new prime minister was Shimon Peres. And then on June 18, 1996, Israel elected the conservative Likud member Benjamin Netanyahu, who had always been opposed to Palestinian statehood and withdrawal from the occupied territories. In his mind, all of Judea and Samaria belonged to the Jews. Worried that the peace process might collapse, the Clinton administration involved itself more actively in future Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. October 1998, the Why Memorandum. Israel and Palestinian Authority resumed their somewhat meaningless agreement of the 1995 Oslo II Accord. The signing took place in the White House by Benjamin Netanyahu and Yasser Arafat, which required Bill Clinton to go back and forth between the White House and the Y plantation on the far side of Chesapeake Bay, Clinton going back and forth 6 times. The Jonathan Pollard affair, spy affair, did not help. And we now add the Y memorandum to the attempts. By December 1998, both parties accused the other of not fulfilling its share of responsibilities, and the further implementation of the agreement remained unfinished. Infighting over the implementation of the Y memorandum brought down Netanyahu's government in January 1999. Israeli Labor Party's liberal progressive Ehud Barak decisively defeated Netanyahu. Barak predicted that he could reach agreements with both Syria and Palestinians in 12 to 15 months, pledging to withdraw Israeli troops from southern Lebanon. In September 1999, Barak and Arafat signed the Sharm el-Sheikh Memorandum, which committed both sides to begin permanent status negotiations. An initial round of meetings, however, achieved nothing. And by December, the Palestinians, totally frustrated by the continuing building of Israeli settlements in their West Bank, suspended talks. And now again, we add the Sharm el-Sheikh Memorandum to efforts. In January 2000, the United States invited Israeli and Syrian negotiators to meet in West Virginia, hoping to reach some kind of agreement. The negotiations foundered when Barak refused to reaffirm Rabin's pledge to withdraw to the June 1967 lines, arguing that none of the concessions offered by the Syrian delegation in return could be considered final, since Syrian President, an ophthalmologist, Hafiz al-Assad, refused to attend. Back in those days, I used to go to ophthalmology meetings. One of the more common presentations were, how could an ophthalmologist be like this guy Assad in Syria? But the fact is that he had superb ophthalmic training in London and was a totally trained, well-trained ophthalmologist, and then leads his country this way. A subsequent meeting between Clinton and Assad in Geneva was a total failure, and I'll add, despite Assad's ophthalmic training. And so the list continues. West Virginia, a total failure. And then the first of 2 major opportunities. And I'm going to tell you of 2, and these are most important to keep in mind. In July of 2000, there was a Camp David summit at the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak's insistence, with the successful precedent of the 1978 Camp David Accord between Begin and Sadat, brokered by Jimmy Carter in mind, and with the 1993 Camp David Accord with Clinton, Arafat, and Rabin in mind, President Clinton agreed to convene another summit at Camp David, where chances look good for our president, the liberal and reasonable Ehud Barak from Israel, and the Palestinian Arafat, to reach a final agreement on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This was an opportunity not to be missed. For years, the thorniest issues remained. The Palestinians demand that their people be allowed to return to their homes. 2, the status of Jerusalem. Whose city would it be? And 3, the final borders of a Palestinian sovereign state.
How's it going, Mr. President? Check out this. When's the day, Mr. President? We pledged to each other we would answer no questions, open no comments. So I have to set a good example. It's difficult to resist. To make it today. Is that the only agreement you have reached so far? That would be answering your question. Thank you. Check out, please.
Now watch this, how well they get into the door. They can't even agree how to walk through a door together. Barak at that meeting was determined to reach a comprehensive agreement. Barak offered Arafat 92% of the West Bank and sections of Jerusalem for the Palestinian state. Barak wanted to make peace. Maybe not everything that the Palestinians wanted, but the best offer since 1948. Bending over backwards to accommodate the Palestinians to the greatest extent possible, in light of right-wing opposition. To the utter surprise and disappointment of the Israeli team, Arafat and his negotiating team refused to even consider the offer. Arafat was turning down the most liberal offer ever made by Israel before or since then, without making a counteroffer. Bill Clinton was dumbfounded by the Palestinian intransigence and furious with Arafat, feeling totally betrayed for all the effort he had put into bringing the two sides together to create a Palestinian state. It was in their grasp. Arafat walked away. These Camp David negotiations collapsed, and the participants disbanded. Barak returned to Israel politically wounded for having angered the right for offering far more than they thought he should have, while disappointing the left by returning empty-handed. Arafat, meanwhile, returned home a national hero. He had stood up to the Zionists, determined to show that the Palestinians would not be satisfied with anything less than receiving their full demands on Jerusalem, borders, sovereignty, and the right of return to their homes. The list continues. On September 28, 2000, Likud party leader right-wing Ariel Sharon made a total unnecessary visit to the Temple Mount. The visit was a deliberate act of provocation to the Muslim Palestinians, followed by 4 years of violent Palestinian protests called the Second Intifada. February 2001, with the liberal Ehud Barak government having achieved nothing, Israeli citizens turned to the right. Ariel Sharon, the right-wing conservative Likud member, was elected prime minister. The peace process was dead. They had tried, and it failed. Palestinian uprising across the West Bank and Gaza continued. November 2001, Saudi Arabian terrorists attacked New York City and the District of Columbia. 4 months later, March 2002, again, terrorism emanating from frustration. The Passover massacre was a suicide bombing carried out by Hamas at the Park Hotel in Netanya, Israel. On the 27th of March 2002, during a Passover Seder, 30 guests at the dinner were killed and 140 injured. And here's a couple photographs of the hotel in which everybody had been dining in that hotel. Again, the Hammurabi Code, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Operation Defensive Shield, March 2002. In response to the Passover attack, 2 days later, Israel launched in the West Bank the largest military operation since the Six-Day War. Israel establishing full military control over the West Bank, destroying Arafat's compound in Ramallah, the city from which Mosen comes, whom you'll meet next week, containing the main offices of the Palestinian Authority. The Israelis put President Arafat under house arrest. And then, completely unnecessary and unrelated, and another terrorist act emanating out of frustration, in April of 2002, Bethlehem's Church of the Nativity, 150 armed Palestinian terrorists violated the sanctity of the birthplace of Jesus by forcing themselves in and barricading themselves while holding more than 40 priests, nuns, and church personnel and 200 other Palestinians as human shields. The Israeli West Bank wall was built during the 5 years of the Second Intifada, between September 2000 and February 2005. The 440-mile wall has been criticized as causing racial segregation and a representation of Israeli apartheid. There is no question that Palestinian attacks from the West Bank on Jews lessened dramatically because of the wall. While the barrier was initially seen as temporary, security measures at a time of heightened tensions, it has since been thought of by Israelis as a political border between Israel and a future state of Palestine, if that should ever occur. What does the wall actually look like? It looks like this. In 2002, March, the Arab states met in Beirut for an Arab League summit. The Israeli forces had confined Yasser Arafat to his Ramallah compound under house arrest. The Arab states, meeting without a Palestinian leader, proposed a self-serving peace agreement, the Arab Peace Initiative. Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres welcomed the possibility of peace, but could not agree to the Arab demand of full withdrawal to 1967 borders and the right of return for the Palestinian refugees in exchange for peace. You remember the words, the roadmap for peace. Such a roadmap for peace during the 6 years 2002 to 2008 would prove to be a doomed set of a plan by the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations, with non-productive meetings spread over 6 years. The principles of the plan were first outlined by U.S. President George W. Bush in a speech on the 24th of June, 2002. But that's not where his mind was. Saudi Arabia had recently attacked the World Trade Center. Our president was focused on his war on terror following 9/11. And so goes another attempt to bring about peace. Both the U.S. and Israel called for the Palestinians to select a new president, as both countries refused to work any further with Yasser Arafat. Arafat appointed Mahmoud Abbas to succeed him as the new president of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. June 4th, 2003, a meeting in Aqaba, Jordan. President George Bush traveled to the southern tip of Israel to meet with the Prime Minister Sharon of Israel and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to discuss the roadmap's peace process. During the Second Intifada, between September 2000 and 5 years later, over 1,000 Israelis had been killed and more than 2,000 injured. Over 2,700 Palestinians had been killed. Another casualty of the Second Intifada. Much of the Israeli public no longer believed that peace was possible or desirable. For decades, the Israeli left had predicated their hopes on the principle of land for peace. If Israel would only surrender most of the land that it captured in 1967, the Palestinians would make peace. The thesis proved to be dangerously naive, and so we go on and add another attempt to bring about peace. What had been Arafat's positions? These were his positions through the 35 years that he controlled the Palestine Liberation Organization. Yasser Arafat, the man thought by many to have engineered the Intifada and to have kept it alive, died in November 2004. Whether he was poisoned by polonium, we don't know. Mahmoud Abbas was elected as president of the Palestinian Authority on the 9th of January 2005. His initial efforts were to bring order to the anarchy in the Palestinian territories and halt attacks against Israel. As a goodwill gesture, Ariel Sharon modified his attitude of belligerency. 2005, February, Sharm el-Sheikh at the tip of the Sinai Peninsula. With Arafat out of the way, a meeting of 4 Middle Eastern leaders took place in an effort to end the 4-year Second Intifada, which had begun in September of 2000. Sharon, Mahmoud Abbas, Hosni Mubarak from Egypt, and King Abdullah from Jordan. They agreed to cease all violence against each other's peoples, marking a formal end to the Second Intifada, and reconfirm their commitment to a roadmap for a peace process. Sharon also agreed to release 900 of the 7,500 Palestinian prisoners being held by Israel at the time, and to withdraw all Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip. He would allow and encourage free and fair elections in Gaza by the Palestinian people. This by the man who had been for his entire life a hawk toward the Palestinians. This seemed like an unreal opportunity. In the Palestinian democratic election in Gaza of January 2006, Hamas won 46% of the seats, defeating the ruling Fatah party. Since that free and fair election in 2006, for which the Palestinians had been given that opportunity by Ariel Sharon stepping back, since that election, 2006, 18 years ago, Hamas has never held another election. Israel and Egypt imposed economic and physical blockades on Gaza, largely sealing their borders, in response to Hamas wanting to wipe out all Jews from the river to the sea. Hamas would continue to launch rockets into Israel. Summer 2006, the Lebanon War. Hezbollah abducted 2 Israeli reserve soldiers. Israel attacked Hezbollah. Paramilitary forces and its navy blockaded Lebanon, which simply led to a stalemate. And then the second major opportunity offered by Israel to find some solution which would be workable on both sides. Neither side would get everything, but the best possible offer was made to the Palestinians. In 2007, November, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert was determined to achieve what Ehud Barak had not 8 years earlier. Prime Minister Olmert and President Mahmoud Abbas met in Annapolis, Maryland, at the U.S. Naval Academy. Both parties again expressed their commitment to a roadmap peace process, but despite intensive negotiations, the parties never reached an agreement. For the second time, the Palestinians had missed an opportunity to seize upon an opportunity. And the list continues. In 2010, Obama and Hillary spent months cajoling Netanyahu and Abbas to meet and talk at the White House. Efforts to reach an agreement by the best of our diplomats would continue for the next 14 years without success. Israel continued fighting Hamas in Gaza. The U.S. Embassy in Israel had been in Tel Aviv since 1948 for a very good reason: not to show favor between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and an effort by the United States to keep some sort of parity and the opportunity for both states to be represented in what both considered to be the seat of their religions, Jerusalem. And the United States, up to that point, since 1948, insisted that they would not put their U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, trying to keep parity between the two sides, keeping it in Tel Aviv. On May 14, 2018, following up on his promise and heeding the advice of Avi Berkowitz, who is a friend of Orthodox Jewish Jared Kushner, the Trump administration chose to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And they did this on the 70th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel. This was an absolute slap in the face to the Palestinians, who had hoped for a two-state solution. It was as if the Trump administration had no regard whatsoever for the feelings or aspirations of the Palestinian people. And here you see Ivanka opening the new U.S. embassy in Jerusalem and the ribbon cutting to celebrate. In September 2020, the Abraham Accords number 1. To make matters worse, from the Palestinian point of view, brokered again by Jared Kushner and his Brooklyn friend Avi Berkowitz, Trump normalized diplomatic relations between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. They joined Egypt and Jordan in recognizing and making peace with Israel. The agreements were called the Abraham Accords, in honor of Abraham, the patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza considered the accords a total betrayal. And while it was significantly a triumph for Israel and its relation with those other Arab states, to the Palestinians, it was a disaster. And these are the countries that Kushner and Berkowitz convinced Trump to help Israel form relationships with. And from the Israeli point of view, this was a major step forward, but a slap in the face to the Palestinians. And then the Abraham II Accord, engineered again by the two young men at Trump's right side, is that they now form diplomatic relations between Israel, Morocco, and Sudan. And so the list continues, the Abraham Accords and the attempts to make peace. And as significant as these Abraham Accords were, it had nothing to do with the Palestinians. It had nothing to do with whose land is it. This had to do with enemies outside of Israel. And then, of course, we all know what happened just over a year ago. The Israel-Hamas war, with Hamas taking advantage of a total Israeli collapse of their intelligence and the Hamas terrorists streaming into Israel and kidnapping and killing Israeli citizens. So I think we're up to date on that. And so I think it's now fair for us to step back and look at all that's occurred and ask the peace accords, why have they failed? All of these years, 75 years, And every attempt by all the leaders that I've shown you, they've all failed. Why? Essentially, it comes down to whose land is it anyway? Israel, they have no and have never had any interest in going beyond the land that was given them, which was 55% in 1948. 10 months later, they had 78% of it because the Palestinians attacked. What they've always wanted is just survival. And they've seen to it, under the dark of night, very early after 48, they imported into Israel from France enough uranium to build an atomic bomb, which they have at Dimona. They don't acknowledge it, but the world knows that the bottom line, Israel has an atomic bomb that they will use, an eye for an eye, if their survival is at risk. All they want are secure borders and no weapons by anybody able to attack them. The Hammurabi Code. What do the Palestinians want? They want a sovereign state. A sovereign state, not just a state, a sovereign state. That's what every group would want. And Israel will never, never allow that because their survival is at stake. And they want something, the right of return. They would like to come. It's as if the Native Americans walked up to your house this morning and said, I want this land back. There used to be a teepee here. That's not going to happen either. And either are the Israelis going to give their homes back, whether in the West Bank or otherwise. So here you see they want the same thing. And the zealots on both sides, we should appreciate over 90% of the people, of the Palestinians and the Israelis, just want to live in peace and be left alone. And we'll hear that from Mosen next week. But the zealots see the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, which it was. This was Native American land before us white Christian Europeans or Jewish came here to live in Hanover. And the Palestinians, their bottom line is all Jews out, whether from the surrounding states or those within. So this is basically all of this, all these peace things getting together back and forth and back and forth, and all of these bright, capable people have played with the details, but nobody has gotten down because basically David Bisno says it's insolvable. They both want the same, and you look at this, and I don't see, and I tried to show you in a couple of the slides, that there were two major opportunities. One by Ehud Barak, the other by Omer, to give the Palestinians as much as they could possibly hope for. And Clinton thought, I've done it, I've done it. And Arafat turned and walked out on him and did not take advantage. And so it's been said in derision and perhaps unfairly, and Mosen will help explain this from his point of view, that the Palestinians have never lost an opportunity to pass up an opportunity. And these two negotiations, which I showed you, are the most glaring. They're not going to get everything, but they were given two opportunities to get the best possible. As Candide said, this is the best of all possible worlds. The right-wing Israelis were furious at Yitzhak Rabin, at Ehud Olmert, at Ehud Barak, furious that they were going to go as far as they did. But that's not what held it up. It's that the Palestinians walked away from the best possible. So, looking now, a summary, over the history of what's happened, here's a list of the attempts to bring about peace, and what do we make of them? Those in lavender were totally successful. The Begin, Sadat, and Carter agreement in Camp David, having to do with Egypt, was successful. Totally successful. That had nothing to do with the Palestinians. The other agreement with Cairo and Israel was the Jordan Peace Treaty. And there is peace between Israel and Jordan. And you can go fly to Israel tomorrow and get in a car and drive across the Allenby Bridge. And you can go have lunch in downtown Amman. No problem. Show your passport and you're in. They're getting along fine. It had nothing to do with the Palestinians. And then finally, the Abraham Accords, from the Israeli point of view, these were totally successful, engineered mainly by Trump's son-in-law and his Brooklyn friend. The Abraham Accords, named after Abraham, have allowed diplomatic relations between these countries, not the Palestinians, but 5 of the surrounding countries. In yellow are the 2 efforts where they were given the best possible opportunities, and they were passed up. And Clinton looked at them and thought he had been totally betrayed by Yasser Arafat. So that summarizes this. And when I put this together, and Faye and I discussed this, and again, I have to thank Faye for putting up with me for all these months. And Faye said to me this morning, David, please promise me this is it. You're done. And I said, well, we'll see. But after putting all this together, presenting this in Santa Barbara, where Mosen did fly out from New York to join us, in which I hope he'll be here next week, which I think he will be. And looking back on it, I have to wonder to myself, in retrospect, what would these 4 men, who were the ones who were instrumental in bringing about the State of Israel, Baron Edmund de Rothschild, David Ben-Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, the chemist in London, and Theodor Herzl, the journalist from Vienna who attended the Dreyfus trial. If these 4 men were here today and knew that there would be 75 years, not one day of peace in the country that they so longed for and wanted to create, they certainly would have thought to themselves to be careful for what you wish. What would they have decided? What would they have thought had they known what was going to ensue? Before I tell you a little bit more about next week, I'm happy to talk about questions, concerns, anything that you'd like to talk about. I'm happy to hear from you. Yes?
Yeah,
Speak loudly, because...
I'm sorry. I have a couple of points I'd like to make. When you say that the Palestinians failed to take the best deal they could have, it sounds as if you're saying that objectively the Israeli position was, in fact, the best they could do. And the Palestinians were being unreasonable. I think it's better to say that the Israeli position was the best that Israeli negotiator could get away with politically. But then you must also say that the Palestinian position was the best that their negotiator could get away with politically. And those 2 positions could not meet. But I don't think it should be expressed as the Palestinians blew this, the Israelis were justified.
I think that's a totally fair comment. And fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not passing a value judgment, but might makes right. And who's got the most guns, the most battleships, wins. Whether it's the Americans against the American Indians or anywhere else in the history of the world. And it's also fair to say, if you read the history, that the early Zionists knew there was going to be opposition. They absolutely knew that. And so prior to 1948, they brought in all kinds of ammunition, warfare, into Jerusalem, knowing that the Arabs were going to attack. The Israelis, I'm not sticking up for the Israelis or the Palestinians. I understand the problem. But I do also appreciate the reason why the Zionists went to this land, to escape the hatred. And that's just a fact. Okay, now what happens? I don't have a solution. But they expected this attack because they had displaced 750,000 Palestinians from their homes. It was horrendous.
Well, that's kind of my second totally unhelpful point. The idea of a Jewish state, or of an Islamic state, or of a white Christian America are equally illegitimate and unsustainable. That's right. But until hearts change, when is that going to change?
That's right. That's how the world is, not what we'd like. And you can easily say, is Israel a democratic state? Is it an apartheid state? All of those are valid criticisms. All of those are valid criticisms. And I can tell you that everything has to be judged from the point of view that the Israelis have enough weapons to defend themselves and believe in that Hammurabi Code. You see it every day in the newspapers. An eye for an eye. All they want to do is be left alone. The Palestinians don't want to leave them alone. They want their land back. And ask the question as we ask, whose land is it? Anyway. George?
Talk a little bit about the start of Israel.
I did that last week and you weren't here.
Yes.
The Palestinians haven't been embraced by their Arab brethren. We're talking about the fact that you can't become Palestinian, move to Jordan, or move from Gaza to Egypt. I worked in Saudi Arabia. The Palestinians worked as managers for the Saudis, but they had no citizenship rights. Their kids were not citizens. When they got to be age 65, they were expelled from Saudi Arabia back to Palestine. So they're being, as well, sort of not persecuted, but unwelcomed.
That's what Bob Hargraves is pointing out is that these Palestinians running and left their homes to Muslim countries surrounding Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and Egypt across the Sinai, were all Muslim Arabic nations. And none of them opened their doors to these people in need of a place. And today, you can go to Jordan, you can go to Lebanon, you can go to Syria and see the refugee camps. You can visit them. Faye's son was over there working, and he visited them up in Lebanon at Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. You can go there and see them, and it looks something like the pictures I just showed you. And Mosen will tell you what it's like next week of growing up in one of them. And Bob's point is exactly correct, that right or wrong, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan did not open their doors and welcome them. They are still today living in refugee camps that look like hell. Yeah, that's the sad story. I wondered and had to have this explained to me, for goodness sakes, why doesn't Egypt open up the doors at Gaza and let these Gazans, the thousands that have been killed, into Egypt? They got the whole Sinai Peninsula. You could build cities upon cities there. The Sinai Peninsula is way larger than the whole state of Israel. It's because apparently, I'm not an expert at this, but President El-Sisi is worried about the group called the Muslim Brotherhood. And they're toppling his role as president of Egypt. I can't go into all those details because I don't know all those politics. But it's a very selfish point of view of the president of Egypt, not letting these poor Palestinians out. They're trapped. It's horrible. Yes?
Why do the other Arab states not accept Palestinians? Is it a political chip they hold, or?
Janet, why did not?
Accepting Palestinians.
Who?
The Arab states surrounding Israel.
Yeah, why did the Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, not accept them? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it goes back to the same feeling of why don't we accept everybody running from Mexico or running from Central America? I'm not sure that we're all that magnanimous either. And, you know, it's okay that they should do it, but look at the election last Tuesday. We don't want to do it. I can tell you some very personal conversations that Faye and I have had with someone who helps us at the house, who lives in rural northern Vermont. She is adamant that immigrants are ruining this country, streaming in from Canada, taking jobs. Adamant. And we just don't get into much of conversation because we value her helping with the house. But people really feel deeply about that. And you know, it's easy for us in Hanover. We don't have a problem here, right? So talk is cheap. Our feelings are cheap. It doesn't cost us much to be liberal. Yeah. We don't have, I don't know, 35 or 3,500 people from Argentina or Ecuador moving into Lebanon and Hanover next week. I don't know how we'd feel. Because it's cheap. It's cheap here to be liberal. Oh yeah, we're great. How much does it cost you? Other? Yeah, Jenny.
Question. I understand absolutely this fondness for the land where you were, but what I can't understand is why the Israelis why the Israelis are occupying land which they didn't really have, which the Palestinians have had, and all those Jewish settlements are being built.
Okay, so Jenny is asking, correct me, Jenny is asking, why do the Israelis feel as they have a right to live in the West Bank? Right. That feeling goes back to my very first lecture, is that land was the two nations, Judea and Samaria, under King David, King Solomon, and King Saul. And those are the lands on which the temple was built. And there's no question about it, that was all Jewish land. It was before the Romans came in and kicked out the Jews. Now, 2,000 years later, they come back, and I can tell you in every Jewish service around the world, whether it's on Friday night or Saturday morning, some part of the service ends with next year in Jerusalem. Am I right about that? Absolutely.
Well, I think about it, thinking back to Long Meadow High School, where I had students who were so excited that summer to go to a kibbutz. And they, had no prior family living in Israel, but it was sort of an opportunity to work on a kibbutz, and they thought it was terrific.
Ginny is describing what life was here in the 50s and 60s, and you're absolutely right. Many of us were excited to go over to Israel and work on the kibbutz, work on the land, just like I showed you in my first series of pictures. And it was part of the land. And we were honestly fed this story from the movie Exodus, that everything was milk and honey, and I mean, I wanted to be Ari Ben Canaan. and what could be better than fighting for Israel with Eva Marie Saint on your side and protecting the kibbutz? And nowhere in Leon Uris's book or the movie does it show the 750,000 Palestinians who are leaving with a pack on their shoulders. We didn't know about that. And if you read the histories, of which there are dozens and dozens, written in those early days, they all reinforce that Exodus concept. Now, and I have them listed in your book, the revisionist histories is now taking a harder, realistic look at what really did happen. It wasn't pretty. How do we understand? Not justify it, but understand what happened. The Jews needed a place to go. They were turned down by Franklin Roosevelt. They didn't open the doors. Winston Churchill didn't open the doors. They didn't want them. It's a sordid story on everybody's part. Yeah, Bill.
I don't know how many others went to the talk by it was named Shikaki, Dr. Shikaki at the Dickey Center about 2 weeks ago. He was a noted Palestinian researcher and pollster, and in his polling of the Palestinians, he said about 72% of the Gaza Palestinians are anti-Hamas, very much anti-Hamas,
yes.
And about 60% of the West Bankers are anti-Hamas. And he talked a lot about that. I mean, there's a lot of detail, but that was interesting. And then he also said his surveys showed that both Palestinian groups were very accepting of the Jewish religion and the people. What annoyed them was what Israel did, or is doing, or has done. And it was quite an interesting discussion and presentation, by the way. Yeah.
Bill, I said that, I'm no expert, he is, but the largest percent of Palestinians, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank, just want to live in peace. Kids go to school, have a good meal, just like we do, and not have this. Live side by side, and you should know, in Jerusalem, I don't know how many of you have been to Jerusalem, in Jerusalem there are 155,000 Arab Israelis living in peace, going to school with Jewish kids. They carry their violins and their books, and they're all mingling and having a good time. It's these fanatics who assassinate Sadat, who assassinate Rabin, who blow the whole thing up. Every time there's a move towards peace, there'll be these fanatic zealots who blow it up. Steve?
So does that characterize the total power that the zealots have, or do they have, besides ruining the soup, do they have further power that prevents the vast majority from overcoming their point of view? Why can't the 90% overcome the 10%?
Well, all you need is one crazy guy in a crowd to take a gun and shoot Rabin, or two crazy guys to blow up the hotel on Passover at a Seder service.
But what you're saying is that evokes emotions, mostly of revenge, to get back at the guys who did it. And if you can bypass those emotions and say, okay, that happened, but let's continue forward, nobody seems to be able to do that.
Presently, what's happening now, to the horror of all of us, is that the government in Jerusalem sees Hamas as out to destroy Israel and drive the Jews into the sea. And they're feeling, until we get rid of Hamas, really? They've destroyed all of Gaza, just destroyed it. If there were a group who were going to, well, what did we do with Osama bin Laden? Sitting off in somewhere up in the hills, somewhere. We send our best paratroopers and drones and all and kill this guy. Are we all better the next day? I don't know whether we're better off the next day, but he's out of the way, right? Yes. Nice and loud.
I don't know much about the history of this, but the kinder transport during World War II when children were allowed to leave Germany. You said Churchill didn't open the doors to mass immigration, but did England accept Jewish children?
Yes, there was during the Second World War, there was a group called the Jewish Agency. I can't tell you all the details, but there was a considerable organization called the Jewish Agency. And one of the things they did was make it possible, to the extent possible, to get Jews out from the Nazis and Hitler. And what was known as the kinder transport was the ability to take babies, children, and somehow get them out of Berlin. And actually, my accountant in Atlanta, who I used for years and years, became a very close friend, was a baby who was thrown out of a window at the train station in Grunwald in Berlin and caught by somebody. The train went to Auschwitz, and he was handed over to, quote, the Jewish agency and spirited out of Europe. So to some extent, I don't know the figures on that. How many were allowed children into England? I don't have that statistic. But it was not a lot. Not a lot. And neither Roosevelt nor Churchill wanted. There were 9.5 million Jews in Europe in 1939. By 1945, 6 million had been killed for only one reason. They were Jewish. And you were Jewish if one of your grandparents was Jewish. And so there were 3.5 million left. And they had to go somewhere. And they had nowhere to go. And that's why the fighting between the Zionists and the English, the British, in Palestine during the 30s and 40s leading up to 48. Peter.
America has a policy towards this area of the world. Can you speculate what the election of last Tuesday, what effect that's going to have on this policy going forward?
Should I speculate?
You can remain silent if you want to.
No, I don't feel any need to be silent. I think that, personally, I think it's going to be a disaster for the Palestinians. And Trump is influenced to a great deal by Jared Kushner, who comes from a very orthodox right-wing Jewish background. And I didn't know much about this fellow Avi Berkowitz, but you can look him up. They went to school together. He's also an Orthodox Jewish kid. And they convinced Trump to go through with these Abraham Accords. Those are all good. And they've brought diplomatic relations to these Arab states, and screw the Palestinians. They play no part in it whatsoever. And the moving of the embassy is an indication, above all, that Trump doesn't care. What do I know? I'm sitting here in Hanover, New Hampshire. But I haven't seen any move by Trump to give some thought to the Palestinians. On the other hand, he may have been told or learned from Clinton and our presidents that they have been totally backsided and blindsided, I guess, by Arafat. And all the effort to which Clinton went to make some accommodation came to nothing. Yeah?
More speculation then. If that's true, that the Palestinians are going to be ignored, can you see the blowback onto the campuses and back into the campuses right here in Hanover?
Sure. Yeah, I think what's happening is on the campuses, whether Dartmouth or Columbia, are a real problem balancing free speech and to what extent free speech versus what's referred to as anti-Semitism, or I personally don't think that's exactly right. I think that students rightfully are frustrated with the plight of the Palestinians. So are we. I don't think that anybody in this room who's heard this presentation, I hope from just the facts, ma'am, Sergeant Friday kind of presentation, hates me because my parents were Jewish, or my grandparents, or I don't think it has anything to do with that. And locally, Faye and I happen to think that President Bylock has made very good decisions, and personally, we respect her. I'm not sure what else to say, except Mosen, who you're going to meet next week. I told you a little background, right? Ramallah, West Bank, ends up at Columbia earning a philosophy degree. he was elected because he's so bright, so quick, so compassionate, so charming. He was elected president of the Palestinian Student Association before October 7th. He had no idea anything was going to happen. And then October 7th, and he finds himself president of this organization that wants to protest. And the university looked to him to try to keep some peace, because I know I explained this to you last week. Much of Columbia is controlled by unions, whether they serve food or libraries or all the works. And the unions, like many people, root for the underdog. And there's no question the underdog are the Palestinians. And so they really probably know very, very little of the whole story that I've burdened you with. But still, the Palestinians are the ones being killed. So they've created huge problems on the Columbia campus, and the university is looking to Mosen to try to keep some peace so that the unions don't close down the university. And we'll hear more about that from him next week. Yeah, Bill?
You had referred a little earlier to all the Jewish people being slaughtered and killed during World War II. Having lived in Germany for about 5 years or so, I would visit the Dachau concentration camp, which is a museum and other places, and take people to see that. And I came to learn and appreciate something that should be promoted more in history when we go to school. How the German government decided to keep those camps as museums to send a signal to their people in the world how bad that was. What a horrible thing they did. And most countries would have just destroyed them. But when I investigated that further, it was a decision of the German government after World War II. We're going to keep those camps because we want to tell the world what happened and how bad it was. And so it doesn't happen again. Interesting. That's what I learned anyway.
Yeah. Yes. Nice and loud so everybody can hear you, please.
Pardon me?
Just speak loudly so everybody can hear.
One of the most fascinating lectures that you gave was the one about why the Jews are hated, why people hate them. And I still cannot understand that sentiment. I mean, we're going back way, way back. What was it that they did that makes people all over the world hate them? I don't understand that.
Essentially, for the first 2,000 years, from Abraham, which is 4,000 years ago, to the birth of Christianity, most of that part of the world believed in pagan religions with many gods. Like American Indians, sun god, rain god, Zeus, Apollo, Greeks, Romans, they all had multiple gods. And ever since, and this is Bible, myth, legend, lore, ever since, quote, Abraham, so the story goes, the Jews believed in one God. Neither male nor female nor human, no picture, no nothing, just a concept. And that was anathema to all the surrounding peoples. And it's not difficult to understand that if these, quote, crazy people believe in one God and they're right, then all of us, quote, are wrong. And because this one small group of Jews, they didn't become Jews until they were over in the land of Canaan, but these people who believed in monotheism, one God, believed differently, they were hated. Now, we don't have written records back then, but that's the story that's come forward. After Jesus and the spread of Christianity through Europe, and I heartily recommend you read Constantine's Sword by James Carroll. It's a gotta read. You have the book? Okay. I told you when I had it for 20 years and never looked at it, and I started, and I couldn't put it down. And you will understand how basically the Christian church, but then it became Martin Luther and the Protestant church too, hated the Jews for not believing in Christian doctrine and the Christian story. And all one has to do is go to a country like, I don't know, Mexico or France or Spain, where people are so devout, mostly Catholic, who go every day to Mass and pray. It's like these Muslims. 5 times a day they pray. When Faye and I walked through the Dubai airport and a bell rang off and everybody gets down on the mat to pray, I think they really, truly, to their heart, believe what they're doing. Okay, so just think about this. If you are doing something, you totally believe it such that you envelop this 100% in your life, and this other group doesn't believe it at all, and you consider, well, maybe they're right. Well, maybe if, quote, they're right, then everything I'm doing in my life is a waste of time. And it's better that they not exist and don't raise these questions in my mind. Basically, that's what James Carroll is saying happened across Europe. And the idea that, I can't go through every one of them, but that the Jews were responsible for killing the Son of God. What? And on and on. They've thought differently, really differently, and they've persisted in these beliefs which are absolutely opposed to the basic doctrines of Christianity. They were hated. And some weeks ago when I was dreaming all this up, and I shared this with Faye, because we do together, and Faye said to me, excuse me, Faye, for sharing this, but she said, David, you shouldn't use the word hatred. Well, read James Carroll. These people were hated. That's why the Crusades. They hated the Islamic Muslims too. And they started from France and the Rhine Valley and spread all the way across to Jerusalem. That's a long march, and they did it twice, 1100 and 1300. Killing, because you don't believe what we believe. You're a threat.
I don't think most people here do. I don't go and kill people because they believe in something that I don't believe in. I just don't get it. I mean, we talk about, as many people say, religion is a problem with most things in this world.
It was a different world now.
Perhaps we can say that
Steve?
Even when you were a Christian and somebody believed slightly differently from you, you might regard that as blasphemy, and blasphemy, even within the Christian community, was often met with death. So imagine it being that different from a slightly different Christian belief. That would be enough strength to be across the border into hatred.
Look at the unrest on campuses, whether it's Dartmouth or Columbia or Harvard or any place else. And, disappointingly, students are not saying, I respect the fact that you're feeling differently. Or I'm going to sleep in this tent, regardless of whether it's against the law, until your investment committee divests itself of certain investments that your financial counselors think is a good idea. Right? Bob.
It's always attractive to think we can achieve peace through a treaty of people who have such different opinions. But sometimes that doesn't work. We have 2 examples. In World War II in Europe, it was total subjugation and domination of Germany, destruction of its military, destruction of its government. And then we did the same thing in Japan. In both cases, we helped rebuild those countries afterwards, but there was no compromise. There was no treaty that came to it.
There was no compromise.
No.
Right.
Right. So that may be what happens in the Middle East.
You know, if I'm speaking out of turn because I'm not there and I don't run the government, but I would imagine that the Israeli Knesset, the legislature, would gladly fund the rebuilding of Gaza, schools, hospitals, universities, rebuild the whole thing, if they knew that the Palestinians in Gaza would totally give up attacking the state of Israel and forcing them to disappear, wanting them to disappear. and there was a reason, if I'm correct, Bob, that the Allies did not allow Germany or Japan to ever have an army again. Well, that's what Israel is saying to the Palestinians. You can have what you call a state, but no army. And the Palestinian, we want it all. Is that right? Diane?
In World War II, what we wanted was unconditional surrender. And so if you get unconditional surrender and you call it a treaty, that's really what they did. But there's no bargaining power if you are conceding surrender.
Yes.
When I think of the theory of an eye for an eye, all I can think of is what someone once said, that pretty soon everybody's blind.
Yes.
I want to talk about the religion aspect of it, because one of the hardest things that I have to think about is that for 4,000 years, someone has continued to believe what they were taught at the very beginning of what's written in the book. And as somebody who isn't religious, I have a hard time understanding that over the 4,000 years, no one has questioned this whole aspect of being Jewish and not assimilating to where you go or expanding your view of the world. And as someone who's Jewish, can you explain that to me, that part of it? You hear what I'm saying?
No.
I was brought up Catholic. I was indoctrinated into the Catholic Church.
Okay.
As I grew up, I started questioning the things that I learned or were taught and came up with other answers for myself. So what I'm not understanding is that for 4,000 years, the Jews have believed the same thing that they were brought up to believe. And as they moved through the world, they didn't really assimilate or expand how they viewed religion. They held on to this very narrow view of what it was for them.
Okay, so at the bottom line, yes, the Jews have stuck to their monotheistic religion, right? No face, no person, no, their monotheistic religion, guided by laws in the Torah. Now, in answer to your question that you started questioning and so forth, and that was true for almost 4,000 years until the mid-1800s in Germany, when some, quote, modern thinkers, Jewish, in Germany, pretty smart people, started questioning whether some of these words were God's words or men's words suggesting good behavior. So, for instance, when it says in the Jewish Torah, "Thou shalt not eat pork," okay, "Thou shalt not eat anything that swims that doesn't have scales," shrimp, oysters, okay. In other words, you have to eat only, quote, kosher food. Those laws were passed way back by men who wrote these laws down, presumably for health reasons, because pork has to be cooked to kill trichinosis. They didn't know what trichinosis was. They didn't know what a bacteria was back then, but they knew that you got sick if you didn't cook pork. You have trichinosis. Today, same thing. Now, who wrote those laws? Well, the Orthodox Jews will say that those are words from God. Can't cut your hair, wear various clothes, etc. Those are God's words. In the mid-1800s, the quote, modern thinkers in Germany, Jewish, developed what became known as Reform Judaism, where certain of these laws were admittedly written by man and they don't apply anymore. They don't make sense anymore. And so these laws were discarded, and these people were referred to as Reformed Jews. and they mostly took off in the United States. And Jacob Mayer Wise moved from Germany to Cincinnati. And he started, quote, the Reform Jewish movement in the mid-1800s. And that's what spread across the United States. In London or mid-Europe or in Israel, you can't find a Reform synagogue. But it's about 80% of American synagogues are Reform. So there has been a relaxed thinking in terms of some of the laws, but the basic monotheistic religion remains. That's the best I can do.
Yes. I think part of it is the fact that your identity with Judaism is genetic, is said to be genetic by the Jews. So if you have a mother who is Jewish, you are Jewish, even if your father is not and you're brought up as an Episcopalian. I think that's one of the things that's an issue. And the other one is, I think there's some resentment on being the chosen people, which kind of says to all the other religions, you know, you don't matter.
Yes, coming across as, quote, the chosen people, being given the promised land, doesn't go far with public relations. Right? That doesn't help anybody. But that's the way it has been. That really is a claw in other people's thinking. What do you mean, chosen people? Give me a break. You know, and the promised land, how much of a myth is that? But the fact is, you can call it a myth, but the Jews were there in Judea and Samaria in Jerusalem up until 73 AD.
You know, the rest of us who have Puritan ancestors have a lot of myths to deal with too. And we don't necessarily do them any better.
Yes, Bill?
Commenting on what you said before, when I've been to Israel more often on business, like in Haifa, I would be in meetings and things, and Arabs and Jews were all together. You didn't even notice the difference.
That's what I said. 85–90% of the Palestinians and the Israelis would like to live together in peace and go about their business, take music lessons and go to school. It's awful. But at least I hope this 4 weeks' efforts has been an awakening to why these people can't just get along anyway, because of the dispute, which we didn't answer, of whose land is it anyway. Listen, thank you so much for attending. Oh, wait. I have 2 more slides to show you. Oh, I forgot. Wait. I have 2 more slides. Here's Mosen. And God, Allah willing, he will be here next. I told you he's going to head out from Manhattan next Friday at 6 o'clock or so and drive up here. And I have to share with you 2 more photos that I found. Here's Mosen up on Grafton Pond going canoeing with us. This is what the gentleman looks like. And here he is visiting us in Santa Barbara. And he had left cold, blizzardly Manhattan and was enjoying Southern California last winter. So we'll see you next Saturday, and hopefully Mosen will be with us.